I left the UK in 2004 and spent the next 20 years traveling the world, living in China, living in Japan, and over 25 different countries. So this year marks the 20th anniversary of me leaving the UK. And in this video, I want to share with you the good, the bad, and the ugly of how I now see the UK after these 20 years abroad. But if you're new here, my name's Fred Barton and I used to be a foreign policy analyst and interpreter at the British Embassy in Beijing, and I now make videos about China, the UK, and learning Chinese. I recently spent 6 months back in the UK on a visit there to see my family, and I was coming from a month in India, and the first thing that struck me when arriving in the UK was the state of the roads. The potholes were insane. They were enough to cave in your tires and cave in the rims of your wheels, and nothing was being done about them. I was driving around on these roads, and this was even coming from India, and some of the roads in my area in the UK were equivalent to the roads I was seeing in parts of India. They were in a terrible state of repair and nobody was doing anything about them. In the 6 months that I was there, I saw some very slow progress on certain stretches of road, but basically the roads and other areas of infrastructure were being left to rot and decay. And I was told that it was because there wasn't government spending to refurbish them, to invest in repairs. And it was a very, very noticeable impact when I moved back to the UK for this visit. It was one of the first things that really struck me of just what a bad state of repair the roads and lots of the general infrastructure was in. Things looked neglected and very run down. The second thing I noticed about the UK, and which I'd noticed before on other trips back home, is that the service is generally very bad in the UK. There isn't a strong service culture. I ordered a meal in a restaurant. The young guy taking my order, he was a nice enough guy, but he was unkempt. He didn't look clean. He had piercings all over his face. I'm not some old fart conservative, but he just looked messy for the job. He had a lot of random tattoos, just dirty, poor quality tattoos all over his arms. And he was leaning on the table, like right into my girlfriend's face when we were taking the order. So it was just unprofessional. He didn't look clean to be working in a restaurant. And this is not an isolated case. Across many restaurants and other places in the UK, I know that there is not a strong service culture. And I know these guys are probably not paid particularly well, but in comparison to other countries, people in shops and restaurants, they're generally well presented. They are usually pretty alert and attentive. And oftentimes in the UK, the impression that you get is that these people have just rolled out of bed. There was one guy in another shop who was serving me, looked like he hadn't washed for weeks, didn't really want to interact with me, because I think these low paid jobs in the UK, people feel that it's beneath them, they don't want to do them. So obviously that then comes across to the customer. So your experience generally is very poor. There is not a strong service culture. I understand it's due to economic conditions, and I'm not trying to slam the people in these poorly paid jobs. But as a customer or a consumer, you just know that there isn't a lot of attention or care given to the customer. But just generally in the countries that I've been in outside of England, customer service is much better and there's just more attention to the customer and the customer experience is much better. The third thing that I noticed about the UK is that the heart has been ripped out of the British High Street, out of the town centre. Where I lived, where I went to visit my parents, so many of the shops that were and restaurants that were there had now been boarded up. And I know this is to do with COVID and the impact on the economy, but just walking around town, it looked like a ghost town. It's very depressing. None of the vibrancy was there that there was before. And it just gives a very depressing impression when you've come from other countries where there is more prosperity and vibrancy. The town centre and the high street in a lot of UK towns looks deserted and run down and empty. My fourth view on the UK is that eating out is generally overpriced and a waste of money. This is also combined with a lack of good service, but the food is normally not cooked particularly well. The ingredients don't seem to be particularly amazing. It costs a fortune. And the times that I went out to eat on my recent trip back to England, I said to the people that I was with that we could have just cooked a better meal ourselves at home and we wouldn't have had to go through the poor service, the long wait, the poor food. There was one occasion when I went out with my family, it was an anniversary, and then my mum kicked off at the waiting staff because the food was uncooked. And it just created too much hassle. It would have just been much easier to cook at home. So I don't think England does the hospitality culture very well. It doesn't do food very well. And then you're charged a fortune for it. So in all the countries basically outside of the UK that I've lived in and traveled to, eating out is usually relatively cheap, it's delicious, it's better than you could cook at home, it's a joy to go out. Whereas in England, it's kind of like pulling teeth and you really feel it in your wallet afterwards. The fifth thing that struck me, of course, was the cost of living. England was already very expensive and I think overpriced and poor value for money for what you got in England. But with the cost of living, it had become completely unmanageable. I had the option of staying long, but there was no way I would have stayed in England. I moved on to Taiwan directly after that trip back to visit my family. And it's just such poor value for money. And now with the cost of living crisis, it's even worse. And you see this in the supermarkets, the shrinkflation. A head of broccoli that was 60 pence before would be this big, and now it's like £1.30 and it's barely the size of a tennis ball. So in a country that was already prohibitively expensive in a lot of ways, things have got even more expensive and you get even less for your money. So basically, based on that alone, I would never really choose to live in England. The sixth thing I really noticed coming back to the UK from abroad is that things are generally not well maintained and they are dirty. British people do not look after stuff very well. And I'm talking about in the town centre where I live, the bowling alley, the cinema, the McDonald's, the Starbucks. These places were all filthy. The carpets were really dirty. There were greasy smears on the glass. Everything just seemed very dirty. And this is not just in comparison to places like Japan where things are immaculately maintained. Even compared to places like the Philippines and other places in Southeast Asia where I've lived, things are maintained much better. There's a much greater focus on hygiene and cleanliness, and buildings and shops and restaurants generally seem to be maintained much better and kept to a higher hygienic standard. You see it even in sports centres where the toilets reek of urine and they leave pubic hairs in the toilets and this kind of thing. There just isn't a very good level of hygiene or cleanliness in a lot of these establishments in the UK. And this leads on to the seventh point, which I noticed in the UK, which I never considered before. After coming back to the UK, I see that the general standard of hygiene is not actually that good in the UK. I never considered myself a dirty or unhygienic person, but having been in relationships with women from various different countries, they were surprised that I didn't shower before going to bed, or that I had other practices that they thought were quite unhygienic. I would say, especially in Southeast Asia, the level of personal hygiene is extremely high. And this is obviously not related to personal income. People do often shower a lot more. And I know this is not true across the board. A lot of people in Vietnam, where I am now, and in other places I've seen have poor oral hygiene. But generally, the women especially, they will shower a lot more. Things are just kept a lot cleaner. And one habit that really seemed completely alien and strange to me after living in Asia for so long is the practice of wearing shoes inside the house that you've worn outside. You've been walking around dirty pavements which people have spat on, there's chewing gum on there, dogs have peed on there, potentially there's dog mess there, lots of germs on the sole of your feet, and then you just walk into your house with these outdoor shoes on and rub those germs into the carpet. It seemed extremely strange. And people in Korea, Japan, China, almost Southeast Asian countries, almost anywhere, see this practice as completely bizarre of why would you desecrate your own home with all these germs that you're dragging in from the outside? And it's made complete sense to me. So I've always left my shoes outside the door and had inside slippers. And I know people would say you have slippers in the UK, but I've seen it as a much more common practice where people are like, oh no, you don't need to take your shoes off. And people do walk around in their shoes in the house, which would never happen in most countries that I've been in abroad. The eighth thing that I've noticed about the UK since being abroad for so long is that the dentistry and the healthcare system looks basically broken. I know that you can still get an appointment with a GP, you can get on a waiting list, you can wait a year or 2 years for an operation if you need to. But I don't want to do that. I'd much rather be in Southeast Asia or other countries where I can just pay quickly and easily for excellent standard dentistry and healthcare. I went for an MRI the other day in Vietnam, where I am now. I got an appointment immediately. The process cost me about £120. I had an analysis with the doctor. Everything was done within a few hours. I wasn't made to sit on a waiting list for 18 months. Same with dentistry. I can call up, get an appointment more or less on the same day, get first class treatment, and for about £40 I got dental treatment that would cost about 10 times that in the UK. So I would far rather pay privately in these countries abroad where I can get rapid, very high quality service, just be in and out, and the care and the quality of the service is excellent. The ninth thing that I noticed about the UK is that people are generally depressed. There's very little quality of life, and I've seen this before. This is nothing new to me, but it's really emphasized since being away for so long. Whereas in countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Southern Europe, they eat together, they will drink outside together. And I know this is related to the climate, of course. A lot of the problems in England are related to the climate. You can't go out, you can't physically relax because it's cold. But the UK just looks very dull and grey and depressed. And now that the pubs have been closed in many places, it looks like the only option for people to actually enjoy themselves is to watch TV and drink at home and eat food from the supermarket or takeaways. And that just seems like a very poor way to enjoy your life. Even in poorer countries where I've lived abroad, there are ways of having fun. And even in places like Japan, you can go to a bathhouse for just a few pounds. And there's like wholesome communal activities that people can do together. It doesn't just have to revolve around drinking or watching football like it does in the UK. There are little things, little treats that are affordable for a lot of people abroad, whether it is eating out, going for a meal with friends out, going for a massage, going to, as I say, the bathhouse. These small things just give you that bit of joy of life, which in the UK we don't really seem to have. It's a very atomized society. The main way people seem to relax is by eating crap in front of the TV or watching football or drinking alcohol. Okay, so those are the negative aspects that I've noticed about the UK since being abroad for so long, but there are positive things that I've seen about the UK as well. And the first thing which I absolutely love about the UK is affordable memberships to gyms and leisure centres. In my local town, for about £30 a month, I get access to a very good gym. It has a 25-metre swimming pool. It has a sauna, a steam room, and it really is excellent. Even in countries which are very cheap, like Vietnam, where I'm living right now, gym memberships are still high. I spoke to a friend who recently visited from Bali. He said gym memberships are astronomical over there, up to like $300 as a fairly normal thing. So I do really love the cheap, affordable leisure centres in the UK. I think they're excellent. And for me, I love sports. I love working out. It's a daily practice that I need for my self-care. So that makes a massive difference to me. Related to this is food and diet. Once I've worked out, I want to get good food. And I've always loved the supermarkets in the UK. What I always noticed after years abroad, I would come back for a visit and the food shopping in UK was always the best. And although it has been impacted massively by the cost of living and a lot of things were not even available on the shelves when I went to my supermarkets recently, there were a ration on eggs and other things were actually not in stock. I would say overall, it is still probably the best food shopping that I've encountered anywhere in any of the countries that I've lived in or traveled to. Apart from possibly Vietnam, which has amazing produce. If you want healthy food, you can get kale, beetroot. It's affordable. I really love the food shopping here. But in comparison to places like Taiwan and Japan, where the food is extremely expensive, there's limited range. I really appreciated being able to get good quality produce and a massive range of stuff, and also healthy stuff, and often stuff that didn't have a lot of added sugar in the supermarkets in the UK. After so long abroad, the third thing that I do appreciate about the UK is its overall culture. And in terms of print media, television, radio, comedy, I really miss the comedy when I'm abroad. I think the UK comedy is unparalleled. Been to great stand-up shows, whether you want to go to theatre, listening to programs on Radio 4. I do think the UK is unparalleled in those areas. And because comedy is so deeply ingrained in our language and so on, you really miss that being abroad. The UK sense of humour is very unique, and you can only really scratch that itch when you come back to the UK. And the third thing I would say about the UK that I appreciate since being away is the quality of tradespeople. So for example, it's the rainy season here in Vietnam. There was heavy downpours in the night. The windows were leaking water. I called in a tradesman and he basically rubbed the windows down with a cloth to dry them. And because the rain had stopped, he then said, there's no problem now, it's okay. And I explained that if the rain starts to pour again, which it's going to do this afternoon and evening, there is going to be more leakage from the windows. But he didn't want to do anything about it. He basically said it's fixed for now, which basically involved him rubbing a dry rag over the windows and waiting for it to flood again later. But the quality of tradesmen in the UK is very good. And having lived in a lot of different condos, a lot of different apartments throughout the world and through many different countries, it is a consistent thing. If anything goes wrong, if you've got a leak in the ceiling in your apartment or another problem with your house when you're living abroad, often you will get some guy to come in and he just isn't skilled. He doesn't have a clue. He's getting paid very, very little money, and he'll come in smoking a cigarette, look at the thing for a few hours and be like, yeah, I think it's okay. I put some gaffer tape over the hole. So things don't get done well in terms of repair and maintenance on your houses. So I do appreciate the tradespeople in the UK. The fourth thing that I really appreciate about the UK is the countryside. And having grown up in the countryside, I took it for granted, but having spent a lot of time in very built up areas like Beijing, in Delhi, Tokyo, then coming back to the UK and spending time in the countryside, especially if the weather is good for a change, there is something unique about that. It is kind of a type of unparalleled natural beauty. And I do actually really appreciate a lot of the natural beauty there is in the UK, whether it's the coastline in Cornwall, the Highlands in Scotland. This is something that I couldn't really see because I was so used to it growing up as a child. But moving back for a quick visit last year and seeing these places, it does strike you how naturally beautiful a lot of the UK is. And the final thing that I've learned to really appreciate about the UK after so much time abroad is the British people. Having lived abroad for so many years, the level of banter that I have when I come back home is something that I miss. And obviously, because you have a shared language and a culture, you can interact in a much friendlier, more intimate way than you can with other people, even though I speak some languages quite well abroad. And a lot of people abroad are also very friendly and you can have banter with them. There is something unique about the British people. And I used to think that they were very standoffish and cold, but as I've got older, I've realized that that's kind of a self-defense mechanism. British people appear very reserved and quite cold, but if you open them in conversation, when you chat to someone in the line at the post office or the supermarket, they crack that smile, you know, the defensive, serious mask comes off usually, and they start chatting to you. They're very chatty, very friendly. And apart from Americans who are extremely pro-social, I think the English are some of the chattiest people that I know, and I just really enjoy that banter, and that is one of the things that I do miss sometimes when I am living abroad. So there you go, those are my good and bad points about living in the UK. Overall, I have no intention to move back there. The negatives outweigh the positives for me, but if you want to know more about my experiences living in China and living abroad and my views on those countries, then check out my videos here.